on the one hand, there's the story that I grew up with that a large part of me still believes in, that I might call the story, the Jeffersonian story, built upon the idea of life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness, the rights that are guaranteed to us all, and a belief in, indeed, that that is the story of America. Well, yeah, and well, Mr. Jefferson has been changed as well.
Right. Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
You know,
Yeah.
terribly. And that was only symptomatic. I mean, okay, now we know Mr. Jefferson in terms of his attitudes towards Black people, and the story about Sally Hemings
Yes.
and Jefferson, and it goes on from there. I mean, it's like a recasting. It's not rejecting the ideals that of the Declaration of Independence, but recognizing that they have yet to be achieved. And then the question is, well, why weren't they so easily achieved? And that comes out in my book.
Right.
It's like the chapter on the Civil War, where you have white soldiers and Black soldiers, gosh, for the first time in American history, fighting together. Yes,
Yeah.
in separate units, but fighting together. And they have two very different, several very different, the white understanding of the Civil War, what it was all about, and the Black understanding of the Civil War. And that came right back to Carbondale, because it wasn't just white veterans who came home, who had been born, brought up in Carbondale,
Right.
returned home, but it was also Black freed people who escaped slavery, volunteered to fight in the war on the Union side, and afterwards came to Jackson County. And they had a story which was
Yes.
very,
Yes.
very different than the white majority. And I mean, their story was clear to them. The war was about freedom,
Right.
emancipation.
Yes.
And white America, not just Jackson County, so much of white America, as in the decades after the war, chose to remember it as more of a war between the states. But
Right.
the Black part of it just got forgotten.
Just the idea of calling it the war between the states
Oh yeah. Oh
forgets a whole lot of stuff, doesn't it?
yeah. Oh yeah. And that was part of Jackson County's understanding too, because there was a white memory of the Civil War, and that was perpetuated in, well, the movies came to Carbondale. There was Birth of a Nation,
Yeah.
you know, which silent movie, which talks about Reconstruction, the decade after the Civil War, as a terrible time in which Blacks were given their freedom and they just went amok. And who saved civilization in the South, according to that movie? It was the Ku Klux Klan. You've
Right.
probably seen the movie. It's
Sure.
the end. The
Yeah.
Klan rides into town just the way I remember growing up. You know, how many movies did I see where the Indians were attacking a settlement, and at the end you hear the bugle sounding, and the white cavalry comes march in, and everybody, yippee, you know. Well,
Yeah.
that's the
Yeah.
same story in Birth of a Nation, and it was perpetuated. And it did come to Carbondale. It was shown here, and people came to it. They loved it. And then there was Gone with the Wind, which is a sanitized version of that.
Yeah.
And you know it, and what was happening is these movies, which were being shown in places like the Varsity Theater, on campus at the Student Center in the 50s, were accepted as the story. Well, you know, there were all those people on the northeast side of town who remembered a different story.
Right. Right.
A very different story than the one that was given to the audiences in the theaters. And boy, their story and the white story collide eventually. by the 1950s and 1960s.
Yes.
I
Yeah.
mean, and you think about it, it's like, yeah, the Black story of the Civil War and Black story in a lot of other ways was forgotten. So it's one hand, you have the story of life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, but it's painted in black and white terms, or it's painted only in white terms. And I became more and more aware of it when, I listened to Black people in Carbondale, especially, and became aware of their historical consciousness and awareness. I was learning something myself, and I thought, this is what I have to do. I have to tell this story in terms of how people like myself grew up with a narrative of American history that enabled them to forget so much of this. And
Absolutely. Yeah.
and I had to, and I and my generation of white privileged history students had to relearn everything and struggle. It was a struggle. In a lot of ways, I understand why there's controversy about teaching history in school today, because it is a struggle. Some of our neighbors don't want to hear, and it was hard for me to hear the alternative narrative. Yeah, I got a lot out of doing this book. I got a lot out of it. It was like everything that I had learned, and then I needed to unlearn from my days in growing up in Detroit to moving to Jackson County. All that learning and then unlearning informed me when it came to writing this book.
Well, there's another part to it, and I really have to say you are eloquent in your prose. Is that it, right? Your words are just wonderful, and they paint a great picture, and they tell a wonderful story. But one of the things that I really don't think about too much, or didn't think about too much, was the Native Americans here. And I think you do a wonderful role, especially in that the squares and lines, or I forget what the chapter's title is, and how that worked, and that how that is another forgetting the forgotten.
Yes, it is. And I came to realize that that first chapter starts with people who are writing the first county history in the 1870s.
Yeah.
And I realized, looking at it, that they were beginning to grapple with the very issues we're grappling with today. Because the man who wrote that first chapter on the Indians in Jackson County writes in there that as he's looking at the mounds and everything else and the artifacts of Native peoples before the whites came here, he has to ask himself, what happened to those people? And for a moment, he asks himself, did we, the white people who came to Jackson County, push them out? Well, that's a tough one. Yeah. Because Americans believed, as they learned the Declaration of Independence, that we were a people that had rejected colonialism, had rejected imperialism, and believed in self-determination. Well, if we believe those things, what did we do to those people who were here before we came? And that's a matter of conscience. And some of those people back then, remarkably, for a moment looked at that and they winced. They didn't want to look at it too carefully, but they had seen it. They had seen it. They had said, there's a contradiction here. Did we kick these people out? And if we kick them out, then are we hypocrites? And in order to avoid that, the fact that our community was created by a bunch of land-hungry people who kicked the natives out, you have to rewrite the
Right.
history, and you have to forget the Indian, and you concoct stories about. And that first chapter is just really about that. We are going to forget these people and what they meant, and yeah, and symbolically, it's erased by the very fact we named it Jackson County.
Right.
Andrew Jackson. It isn't funny, but it is
No,
like
it's no, it's not.
it is like it captures, you know, the continuing crisis that this country faces. That even at the very local level is the pervasive belief that those ideals of life, liberty, and rights and pursuit of happiness are us, and then trying to square it with what happens here.